Um, Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our virtual attendees to the Energy Justice Seminar at Yale's School of the Environment, offered by the Yale Center for Environmental Justice. I'm Michael Gelobter, the Executive Director of the Yale Center for Environmental Justice. I want to give you all a little bit of background for myself, but first I want to introduce our teaching fellow, Julia Simon. Come on up so people in the virtual world can see you too. Julia is a PhD student in environmental engineering. We've worked together already for a whole semester on our Environmental Joy Conference, which we had in October. She was awesome, helped us put all the programming together there. And the classroom is full of great Yale students, School of the Environment students. So thank you, Julia. So Julia will be here, is monitoring the online seminar, and will be taking Q&A online and summarizing it every class. So the way the class is going to work technologically is this is a webinar that's open to all registrants. There'll be about 40 minutes of discussion/lecture every week with 10 minutes of Q&A available virtually to virtual attendees, at which point the webinar portion will shut down and we'll move to a closed seminar for students at Yale for about a half an hour till 11:20. So welcome, everybody. I want to introduce myself a little bit. I'm Michael Gelobter. I'm the Executive Director, as I said earlier, of the Yale Center for Environmental Justice. I have been working on energy and climate since the mid-'80s. Started working on climate in 1985, environmental justice in 1984. I've worked because I see myself primarily as a social justice advocate, first and foremost. I've had a pretty diverse career, sometimes directly working for social justice, other times building skills or going into sectors where I felt like I needed to learn more to be able to be more effective. So I've been in academia, advocacy. As an academic, I helped start the environmental policy program at Columbia University in the early 90s. I will say that my academic mentors, for those of you who saw the movie Oppenheimer, the field of interdisciplinary environmental studies owes most of its existence to nuclear scientists coming out of that era who understood the need to think across boundaries to solve some of the world's big environmental problems, mostly initially around nuclear energy. And obviously, there are lots of other environmental problems we've become aware of since. And what's exciting about that generation, you get a sense of it in Oppenheimer, is that there's a way in which environmentalism calls forth both science and advocacy, a sense of what we want to do to protect the natural world and to protect human health and alleviate suffering and increase well-being. And those are really interdisciplinary activities, given the importance we'll talk about this semester of energy in people's lives. So from academia, I've also worked in government on Capitol Hill. I was director of environmental quality for the city of New York, and had the privilege of leading a group called Redefining Progress, which wrote the revenue provisions of most of the climate legislation in the US today. So basically, functionally, a carbon fee. I can't believe I'm saying the word tax on an open mic. I don't believe in ever using that word if you're going to try to win in this country. But we collect about $3 billion a year in the US off of carbon fees, thanks to that legislation. And we also wrote the first versions of AB 32, which was the first comprehensive climate legislation adopted by a state in California in 2006. We also had the lucky chance. I had the chance to work with Wangari Maathai and Sunita Narain in India in 1995 to sort of help start the climate justice movement. Early days, had our first meetings at the COPs in 1998, and then wrote the first report on African Americans and climate in 2004, a year before Katrina, and in 2005, the first on Latinos and climate. And I think we did one on Native Americans and climate after I left the organization. And then I went into clean tech and started doing clean tech software for a while to try to use the power of business to shift the market away from dirty energy to clean energy and helps to solve climate change. And I've gone back and forth basically between advocacy and research and business ever since. I'm really happy to be teaching this class this semester, excited to have you all here and excited to have the virtual attendees here as well. So welcome. I want to start by sort of a quick Energy 101, very briefly. You may know this. Hopefully you've learned some of these broad concepts, but I think it's really important to understand how people think about energy so that we can think about the degrees of freedom we have in addressing energy problems and the ways in which energy justice may intersect energy use itself. Energy is often characterized in sort of three ways: primary energy, final energy, and productive use. Primary energy being raw materials like coal or sunlight or oil. Final energy being what's delivered to people in the form of electricity or gasoline, the thing that actually does the work, those of you who know the physics definitions of energy, work is intimately tied to that as a thermodynamic concept. But it's really, in general, when you're looking for a radical solution for an energy problem, start at the right-hand side. What are people getting from the energy? What is energy delivering to them? What is the service that's being provided? So when we think about transportation energy, for example, we can understand that the service that's being provided might be the ability to do work with colleagues that might now be able to be done on Zoom, right? And all of a sudden, the energy service profile of the ability to do work with colleagues changes radically because you're not driving into the office every day. Sometimes it's very straightforward, like I need to get from point A to point B, but there are many ways to do that. Mass transit, walking, biking, an electric car. So the question is, often when you're trying to think creatively about energy, to think about the service that energy is providing: lighting, transportation, the manufacturing of something, and then thinking about alternative ways that can be done can help open new doors to technical solutions, as well as social solutions, as well as just solutions. Within the first stages, primary and final energy, there's sort of three ways that we can sort of think about shifting systems generally. One is efficiency, always the best. We're not going to get into it too much in this class, but it's possible at rates of efficiency improvement that places like China achieve regularly for the world to be steady state from an energy use perspective. Energy use does not have to grow for people all around the world to get the same energy services we have today if, for example, we can improve efficiency by 2 or 3% a year every year, which is a number that's regularly hit in places like China. The US sometimes hits 3% a year in energy efficiency improvement, but it's definitely achievable. Switching from different fuels and moving to electricity, which has become increasingly an option that people want to look at as well. On the use side, there's conservation, which is to sort of do more with less, to get more productivity per energy unit, and structural change. And that structural change can be anything from revamping an old factory so that the pumps are more efficient, the pipes are smaller because there's excess capacity. And a lot of old buildings like this, for example, are overbuilt in many ways. And you can think about how do you build buildings differently to get the same housing service, or factory differently to get the same productive service. But there are also structural changes like more dense cities, or increasing urban density, for example, to reduce dependency on fuels for transportation. So these are sort of some of the fundamental concepts that are out there around energy, and definitely worth keeping in mind. Obviously, this slide will be available as you think about alternatives, ways that you can move the world towards a more energy just approach. This kind of technical basis of thinking about how energy works, what it delivers, and the levers of intervention is really critical to opening up the options you can look at. At the same time, we're actually focused on energy because it's a source of a lot of problems in the world. It's a source of most indoor and outdoor air pollution, most radioactive waste, much of the hydrocarbon and trace metal pollution of soil and groundwater. Essentially all the oil that's out there in nature or that's been leaked, or that you see in oil slicks in a pond is created by humans. And of course, global warming and CO2 emissions. If you want to understand kind of the magnitude of our impact, this is the ratio of natural to human, human to natural impacts. 30% of all particulates in the world are generated by human beings, and particulates include things like ocean spray. So you got to think about how much activity we're involved in if we're making as much pollution as ocean spray or dust blown up in the Sahara by big winds. Mercury and sulfur, each 70% is produced, although they're naturally occurring substances. 70% of their mobilization in the environment is from the energy industry. Oil emissions, 1,000%, right? So 10 times more than nature ever leaks or puts out there is being put out by humans as leakage or spillage all the time. That's not mercury and sulfur. That is lead. Sorry, wrong label. So lead is 1,300%, and also due to energy use in particular, particularly leaded gasoline and other forms of industrial use. So energy is a pretty nasty thing. It causes a lot of problems. It's one of the reasons we care about about energy justice. In general, you can think that energy is responsible on average for about 80% of all environmental problems. If you sort of go back up the supply chain and think, okay, what are the problems we have in the environment? About 80% of them are probably caused by energy use, exploration, extraction, burning, etc. So that's some some background. the reason we're sort of up against it with energy is people really do need energy. It provides a lot of good stuff, right? Energy poverty is a major source of suffering globally, and affordable energy is necessary for prosperity. Clean energy is necessary for health, not just because the energy hurts people, but because you need it to stay warm, to get over diseases, to get to the hospital, to feed yourself. Energy is pretty critical. And we need renewable energy for peace and planetary stability. Without renewable energy, we'll continue down the path of either a global warming impacted future, or potentially a nuclear energy impacted future, and all the consequences that we're starting to see today of both of those things. So it's a tough problem. So what I want to do a little bit now is start by doing some so for this in the semester, we're going to be addressing many of these dimensions with guest speakers. I'm going to be giving some lectures as well. So throughout the semester, we'll be covering these topics and going into more depth. I want to start really by laying a groundwork for defining justice, particularly for and thinking about it in terms of this class and how we're going to go through different topics through the semester. So this is a great pyramid sort of around justice, sort of talking about three layers. One is the context. A lot of times we focus on the top of the pyramid. Who's exposed to what are the differential exposures to different populations or different impacts on different people, and that's called distributive justice. Underneath that, many of you have probably run across the concept of procedural justice. How are people involved? How do we give people a voice in critical decisions in their lives? But underneath all that is really the structure that people operate in, and also who they are, what their identity is, what their relationship to energy is, what their relationship to the world is, and how that's mediated by energy use. And that's called structural justice and recognitional justice, to bring issues of identity and culture to the fore. And it really is a pyramid in the sense that a lot of people's outcomes, a lot of the outcomes trickle up from that bottom, from the structures that people operate in, from who they are, what their identities are, what their relationship to energy is at a fundamental level, through procedures that they go through in their lives, to finally the outcomes in terms of what they face. So I'm going to go into a little bit of depth trying to give some examples for each of these. But there's also a feedback loop in the sense that when there are differential exposures or differential experiences of the environment, it goes back in and influences the structures people operate in. They have to migrate, for example, when there's a big toxic spill near them, or move. The emissions will change settlement patterns. And people will change how they live or where they live because of the distributive questions at the top. So it's kind of a continuous loop between structures, which inform how people live and operate every day, which then inform their exposures and their costs and other things like that. And those then come back down and feed back in a loop in some sense of the structures that people live in as well. So let's start at the bottom, at the base context. I'll give you some examples just to give you, there's lots of ways the context is and recognitional justice is critical. I want to give a couple of examples. One, for example, is the wage paid in different industries. The dirty energy industries in general have about 50% more ethnic diversity in the United States, more people of color in dirty energy industries. One reason is that they pay better. They're more established, and a coal miner on average salary in the United States is about $75,000 a year, versus a solar installer, which is about $49,000. And the range dips a lot lower for solar installers because they're not unionized in many settings, as are coal workers. So this is an example of kind of just the labor structure. Solar and wind jobs are growing incredibly fast, and yet they pay 30, 40, 50% less than dirty energy jobs do today, and probably have less security as well. What we do about that, how we think about that, is critical to the evolution of new energy industries, because energy is a major source of employment for lots of people. And how do we engage people at lower salaries when higher salaries are available, for example, in dirty energy industries? That's a contextual or structural factor. Here's an interesting contrast. This is a comparison of consumer spending in 1990 and consumer spending in 2000. The blue slice is how much the average low to middle income family spent on transportation and education. In 1900, people were mostly walking someplace. They weren't using a lot of energy for transportation. They weren't spending a lot of their money on transportation, and they weren't spending a lot of their money on education either. Fast forward to this century, the average low-income family in the United States is spending 40% of their income on transportation and education. That's a structural factor, right? It means that people live someplace not pretty far away, maybe, than where their kids go to school. They pay money to get their kid to that school. Sometimes they pay money to have their kid be in that school. They commute some fairly long distance, an hour or two a day, to work. far away from where their kids go to school. And this is a factor induced by fossil fuel use and the structure of cities and the structure of the way the lower and lower and middle income people live in the United States today. Now, to me, this is actually a really hopeful chart because it actually says in 100 years, right, fossil fuels was able to change 40% of how people spend their money every day, which means sometime in the next 100 years, we can shift it back in another direction and have people spending less of their money on things that are fossil fuel related, living close to where their kids go to school, walking to work, visiting their kids at lunchtime, for example. But this is a great example of kind of a distributive outcome that's very structural at the same time, right? Things really changed radically because of the availability of transportation fuels, and transportation that was based on fossil fuels, where people got educated, where people lived, where they worked, changed radically over the last 100 years. A lot of times when I've worked in the internet some, and I often use the analogy that the internet is a little bit like Detroit in 1935, right? There were cars everywhere. Everyone knew, oh, I'm a car engineer as being a software engineer. I work in the auto industry, right? But we hadn't built freeways yet. We hadn't built suburbs yet. The internet is similarly shifting the landscape and has just started really impacting the structures of everyday life. And maybe if we use it the right way in a good direction with respect to fossil fuel use and energy justice in particular. At a global level, oh, I'm sorry, let me go to some, not all of what I want to say is on the slides. One, yeah, well, let me go to a global level. This is a history of global GDP. And you can see the red and green lines are India and China. And they were the dominant and largest economies in the world in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, right? And once colonialism started, they took a pretty steep dive, and the United States and Europe and the United States rose in terms of GDP. And of course, India and China are growing back up again now, and it's probably by the middle of this century, China and India will once again be dominant at the level they were prior to the 17th century. And this gives you a lot of information about the history of energy use as well. One of the most fascinating things, which I just learned about a year ago, was that oftentimes people think of the start of the modern oil industry as in 1859 in Titusville, in the first oil well, quote unquote, the first oil well theoretically ever drilled. The reality is the first oil wells started popping up in the mid 1700s in Myanmar, or Burma, as it was called back then, and had a booming industry. As a matter of fact, the king of Burma nationalized, the kingly equivalent of nationalization, his oil industry in 1854 to centralize control and to start controlling prices. So he created basically an OPEC, or a cartel, in 1854. In 1885, the British invaded Burma and functionally shut down the Burmese oil industry. So there was a booming industry in Asia, booming oil industry in Asia, before there was one in the United States. The United States is often seen as the home of the initial and the growth of the fossil fuel industry. So what this picture tells us is that things like colonialism play a major role in global justice as well. And it cuts both ways, though, right? Imagine if Burma had not been interrupted in its energy use, right? Would Asia have been using fossil fuels at much higher levels than it is today if it had been permitted to continue to grow on the path it was on in the 17 and 1800s? So it's not an unambiguous question of, oh, colonialism is what created climate change or created energy use. Colonialism also interrupted energy use growth. As you can see here, right, the energy use would have probably started tracking to the GDP if the GDP's growth hadn't been so interrupted. So the problem of energy and energy justice is a global one. It implicates clashes between cultures and civilizations, colonialism and imperialism as well. Yeah, so it's a really fundamentally, it's whenever you start to think that energy justice is a question of sort of who did something wrong and who did something right, you have to often look at yourself or look at the people you're considering as having been unjustly affected, and think also that we're all very much deeply implicated in the choices we make as well. There are definitely people who don't do good stuff in the energy space, but we're all much more deeply tied to these histories than we realize at deep cultural levels as well. There are also let me go on to talk about a little bit about so basically recognitional and structural justice involve things like urban structure, relationship to space, employment opportunities, the history of colonial intervention, cultural and faith practices around energy, lighting, cooking, transportation. There are people who are tied to, for example, cooking their food with wood in large swaths of the world that will have to should probably shift away from that for their own good, for their own health, for the health of the environments around them. Those are choices and changes folks are going to have to make and think about, but they're a critical part of the base that we're working from when we're trying to achieve energy justice. So procedural justice is really about questions of who participates, who decides on energy, in the energy justice space, who decides on the energy mix, on costs, who's going to pay for what things specifically. So how do we make choices around efficiency? How do we make choices at a regulatory level in countries that have energy regulation, at the utility level, energy regulation, the ownership of energy assets? What are the transportation options and people's voice in choosing those transportation options? You know, they're oftentimes the building of highways is not a particularly democratic function. People don't often get the choice to not get in their car and to get a mass transit system instead of a highway. But that's a procedural issue, is how those decisions are made. The standards that are set around light, around appliances, around heating, around air conditioning, and much more. So these are examples of procedural justice. We'll get into that a lot, and all the speakers are going to address that because they're going to come to you to talk about health, but also about how choices are made with respect to health outcomes, for example. They're going to come talk to you about employment, around indigenous issues, and the question of voice and people's place at the table is critical in all of that. There's another concept called participatory justice, which is not just how are the processes work, but how do we ensure that the voices are at the table? Right? So it's beyond the processes that might be good, might be bad. Also, do we have the right people at the table for these decisions? And finally, there's the question of distributive justice. And I want to give some examples, and this is the one that sort of occurs to people first is, you know, what are the outcomes? What are the costs? Who's exposed? Who's paying more? Some of the core concepts in that include energy burden, which is defined as how much of your household income you spend on energy, the ratio of household energy spend to total household income. Here's a map of how it is in the United States. And this is the red number red numbers indicate a high energy burden, high sort of being defined as something that deeply affects people's well-being, their ability to spend money on other things. And the red represents the median low-income energy burden by region. So you can see some regions like the Northeast, New England has a 10.5% energy burden, which is actually considered severe. Anything over 10% is considered severe. So on average, low-income families in New England face a severe energy burden. Mid-Atlantic is 9.4%, and different parts of the country have different numbers. But you can see it's a significant difference between the average for people in that region and the average for low-income people. And this is a core energy justice issue, is how much of your money are you having to spend to power your life? Also has serious implications by race. Black households have a 30% have a 36% higher energy burden on average. Native Americans 36% higher, Hispanic households 28% higher, and Black households on average are 45% higher than non-Hispanic white households in the energy burdens that they face. And this is independent of income by race purely. At a global level, there are really significant disparities as well. This is cumulative emissions from 1750 to 2021. 10 years ago, the United States was still responsible for 36% of the CO2 in the atmosphere, cumulatively. Now it's down to 25%, and shifting is becoming more democratic, shifting to more nations over time. But you can see the United States is still responsible functionally for 25% of CO2 emissions in the or global greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, and therefore really responsible for about 25% of climate effects that have been felt in the world to date. Followed now by China, much of Europe, and then other countries at much lower levels. And you can see why in international negotiations, the question of who has to take action is really front and center, because on a per capita adjusted basis, these disparities are even greater, meaning that the average endowment that an American, a US citizen, receives in their historical endowment of CO2 they've been allowed to emit is anywhere from 40 to 100 times higher than, let's say, the average Chinese citizen over the history of that nation. So there are really significant disparities there. As an example of how this plays out in practice, this is the G8 eight European nations delay in the Kyoto Protocol. That black area is how much they slipped in their compliance with the Kyoto agreements between 2008 and 2012. So 4 years of slippage was on the part of 8 European countries was equivalent to 40 years of emissions by India. Right? Whoops, we can't quite meet the standard we agreed to in a treaty in Europe, and that was literally in the mid 2010s, 40 years of emissions future of India's future emissions, which of course could make India reluctant to come to the table as a quote unquote equally responsible player to Europe. So these kinds of statistics are really helpful to look at and understand in terms of seeing what seeing how energy justice plays out at a global level as well. And we'll go into more of these kinds of details. There are 3 problem sets during the semester, one of which will be to calculate energy burden. Not a super hard thing to do, but I'll ask you to get your hands dirty a little bit with the data and the data sources for that work. Okay, there are also really significant implications around the energy transition, right? We know we have to stop using fossil fuels, hopefully as soon as possible. Some of the facts include the fact that 80% of proven reserves, not even, so when people are looking for new oil, this does not count that. 80% of the oil, coal, and natural gas, we know where it is, we know how much there is, can't be used if we're going to stop at doubled CO2. Literally, we're going to expropriate from somebody who owns about 80% of what's proven in the ground today and say, no, you can't do that. So it's going to cause a lot of conflict, a lot of issues around how do we make those adjustments. There are countries that depend, small countries like Trinidad, for example, who increasingly depend on oil revenues because oil's been discovered there recently. Countries like the United States, who's now the largest net exporter of oil in the world, while also taking pretty aggressive action on climate change. So there's a lot of contradictions and a lot of issues in what countries are going to face. And that's a clear energy justice issue in terms of the history and the history of colonialism, the history of industrial development, and what countries are going to be able to do for their energy future. The good news, of course, is that the alternatives are very cheap, but who owns them? Wind and solar are cheaper than almost any other form of energy today, but who owns them and how do you make that transition is going to be a critical part. So these questions of the just transition are really critical to the question of the future of energy and the future of energy justice. Here's an example for the industrial sector. 20% of total emissions are industrial, and 80% of global industrial emissions are emitted by about 150 companies. It says 170 here, but that's because we started adding some extra ones. But about 150 companies in the world are responsible for 80% of global industrial emissions, or actually, industrial emissions are 25% of total emissions. These companies are responsible for 20% of total emissions in the world. So the problem is really concentrated in certain ways, and that leads to a lot of justice issues of how do you take their emissions, their right to emit, their use of the atmosphere away from them. How do you do that in ways that spread the benefits of what they do while not permitting them to continue to soil the environment the way they do with emissions? So there's a lot of big questions in how we make the energy transition. One of the things I really like to emphasize, and having done the work for a while, is I sort of refuse to own the problem, right? People say, oh my God, it's going to be so hard to clean the environment, to get rid of fossil fuels, to make the energy justice happen. And I want to just sort of give you one enumeration that helps illustrate why a world without fossil fuels, a world where we achieve energy justice, is likely to be much better, will be much better than the world we live in today. And you can look at what's happening in Ukraine, you can look at what's happening in the Middle East as examples of the ways in which energy is playing a really critical role in conflicts and in difficulties. In the US, I'll use the example of our invasion of Iraq, which was estimated to cost the United States $6 trillion. And by the estimate of most economists and most political scientists, we fought that war for oil functionally. It was central to the reason we invaded and central to the conflicts that we faced in the region. So $6 trillion, I want to illustrate what $6 trillion really means. For $6 trillion, you could buy a $400,000 house, put it on $60,000 worth of land, fill it with $15,000 worth of furniture, and put a $25,000 car in the garage for each and every household in New England. You'd still have enough left to build a $20 million hospital and a $20 million library in every city and every town in the region. There's about 2,000 cities and towns in the regions. So you could build a hospital and a library in every one of those places. You'd still have enough money to build 2,000 schools at $10 million apiece. And you'd still have enough money to put aside at 5% annual interest, a sum of money that would pay a salary of $60,000 a year for 10,000 nurses and 10,000 teachers, and an annual cash allowance of $10,000 for each and every household in New England. not just this year, but forever. That's how much $6 trillion is. So we think about how much of the world we've influenced to fight that war, how much we spent, how much of our future we mortgaged. And we think, oh, if we can get that out of the water, if we could stop doing that, think about how much better off we would all be. So, and of course, I want to try to wrap up a little bit, but basically, there's also good news, and particularly in the United States, over the last year and a half, 2 years, functionally, the federal government has adopted an investment plan of over $2 trillion, more or less directly related to energy. One of the reasons the field of energy justice is changing so fast is we've moved from characterizing the problem and talking about it in the ways that I just have to a situation where there's a lot of money in the water being spent today to address questions of energy and to actually address questions of energy justice. The first executive order President Biden signed was something called the Justice 40 executive order, which said that 40% of the benefits of this infrastructure spending needed to flow to disadvantaged and low-income communities. How we're going to do that, it'll be something we talk about this semester, and there are a lot of justice issues in how that's going to happen, and a lot of hiccups and bumps along the way. But functionally, we are sitting in a world where 40% of $2 trillion of investment is meant to flow into our communities, into low-income communities, into communities of color, to try to redress historical inequities and to try to achieve some measure of energy justice. It's an incredible moment. My guess is that those of you going into the energy field, this funding will dominate your employment prospects for the next 5 to 10 years, because people are building things, creating new industries, spending a huge amount of money on this stuff. At a global level, a lot less has been committed so far, but there's a commitment to have $100 billion a year for loss and damages, which does include energy transitions in developing countries and countries that need to find a way to not jump on the fossil fuel wagon or to get off of it faster. So there's a fair amount of money happening in the international arena as well. Falls far short of what people think is needed, but there's a lot of private sector activity to drive investment into those markets as well. So we're in an incredibly exciting time where it's not just, oh my God, there's this terrible problem, but there's actually a huge amount of money being spent, which at least on paper is committed to solving some of the inequities that people face. And this really comes back to the core of the reason for just transition. People often talk about stock markets, the companies that I showed you earlier, that's a campaign that's aimed at hitting them in the stock market with investors, pushing them to divest and to stop using fossil fuels. And the market capitalization of the fossil fuel industry is about $7 to $10 trillion, depending on where markets are and stuff like that. But the cash flow into fossil fuels, the cash flow in those, the annual flow of money over the next 60 to 70 years is more like $300 trillion, right? It's not just the market cap, but the amount of money involved in the energy economy. So that's $300 trillion of truck drivers and lunch counters and paperwork pushers and transportation people who are engaged in the fossil fuel industry heavily. And unless we think about how to make the transition and how to shift that spending in ways that keep people with livelihoods, we can face a lot of backlash for the transitions that we want to make away from fossil fuels. It's not just the evil fossil fuel companies, it's many of us who are employed or dependent on those industries for our income and for our lifestyle. So it's really critical to think about the justice of the transition as well. And again, there's $2 trillion in there driving that transition, and how we engage that money and how we use it to make that transition happen in a better way is something that a lot of people are going to be thinking about for the next few years, and something hopefully we'll spend a lot of time on in this class today. Last but not least, I want to also say that there are a lot of radical solutions out there and a lot of rethinking because of the depth of change that we have to achieve. It's, for example, the idea of seeing energy as a public good, and having the provision of energy no longer be a market element, but being a public good, or like a highway or a road, is increasingly being explored. Some people have estimated that could cost as little as $1 trillion a year, which is not a lot for the global economy. It might be higher than that, but you can provide a whole lot of energy for $1 trillion a year because the cost of solar and wind has dropped so low. And also, frankly, I think people are thinking about revisioning what we mean by climate anxiety and what we mean by the anxiety around the present energy systems. Obviously, it's terrifying to think about things like five major hurricanes a year, or the kinds of flooding that happen all over the world, or natural disasters. But when you start putting in context of the spending of our spending on war as well, and the things like that that are related to fossil fuel use, it opens up the possibility for really revamping economic systems and revamping an international order towards more peace. And if we think about or visualize a world where energy is available abundantly to people in a just way and in a clean way, we can think of a world that's really quite different and quite a bit more just. So with that, I'll just end with this slide, sort of talking a little bit about the kind of topics we'll be covering. Energy justice touches on a ton of stuff. This slide covers some of it. And we'll be spending the semester going through a ton of these topics every week. We'll either I'll speak about them, or one of our guest lecturers will speak, or we'll engage in a conversation and move forward in this semester to learn a lot about energy justice and hopefully give us some experience and exposure. The class will also be feeding into a new certificate program that we're offering with the Yale Center for Environmental Justice, and the Center for Business and Environment at Yale is launching a certificate program called the SEED program, the Clean and Equitable Energy Development Program, which will be a 12-week certificate program for practitioners and professionals in the field and community organizations, churches, and others who want to get involved in clean energy in their communities in a hands-on way. So some of the lectures you see here will be used in that class as well, and that class is launching formally. We're sort of in beta testing this spring, but the first cohorts will be enrolled in October. And we're hoping partially to serve the communities that are trying to tap some of that $2 trillion and really get them up the curve so they can use that, ideate and own their own projects, design their own projects, and achieve energy justice in the ways that are appropriate to their communities. So with that, I'm going to ask Julia to see if there's any questions that have come up on the internet or the webinar attendees. Answer some of those for a few minutes, and then we'll wrap up the webinar for this week and see everybody next week. Yes, sorry. Yes, I mislabeled. If I was labeled 1990, it's 1900. So the spending on transportation and education was 2% in 1900 and 40% for low-income families in the US today in 2000. All right. Any other online? All right. So what I'd love for, I should have said this at the beginning, folks in the webinar can please type in, and I'll be asking the classes as well when we shut down the webinar, things that they hope to get out of the seminar series, topics you'd like to see covered, questions you'd like to see answered. If you're one of our online attendees, please shoot us that in the Q&A or by email to Julia, and we'll try to make sure that some of the conversations we have this semester cover that, or they come up in questions that we ask during the webinar portion of the series as well. Okay, another one, yep. Yeah. Question is, can I discuss the connection or the connection between energy justice and environmental justice? Yeah, that's a good, environmental justice is a very broad category, which in many people's view includes things like climate justice and energy justice. Environmental justice is one of the classic definitions is about justice and how energy affects where we work, play, pray, and live. It's very broad. Environmental justice is a very broad category, and it sort of depends. Some people think of energy as a subsidiary energy studies as a subsidiary to environmental studies. Obviously, in many ways, energy studies is an older field because it's been technically exploited for hundreds of years. But functionally, I would say a lot of the concepts from environmental justice apply to energy justice. I would say one of the big differences is how much more focused or narrowly we can think a little bit in the energy space, because those are practical arenas of professional practice. They're markets, there are channels in which energy flows. So you can kind of bound an energy problem in many ways a little more easily sometimes than an environmental problem. Although as an interdisciplinary energy, as someone trained in interdisciplinary energy analysis, I would say that energy has a pretty broad social and cultural and economic footprint as well. I functionally, I think it's really a question of focus. Energy justice is tied to sort of the practicalities and the implementation of how we make an energy transition. I'd say that's the biggest reason it's coming up. To the extent it's thought of as the ways in which energy justice affects people's well-being and health, it's sort of more a purely environmental justice question. But when it starts to get into things like infrastructure and how people live their lives and how they spend their money, there are specific things about energy that are more actionable or more narrowly can be defined more narrowly. And I think the other way is that the energy transition involved in climate change and the ways different countries are spending a lot of money to make that energy transition. So in some sense, it's a specialization of environmental justice, and one in which we can sort of deepen our practice in a real world way around a problem that people are trying to fix. Anything else? All right. Well, with that, and every week we'll have 10 minutes after the lecture for the virtual audience to ask questions of the speaker, and then we'll wrap it up and bring it back to the classroom. But today we'll wrap up now, and thank you. See you next week, everybody.